Hi everyone, so the second resource I'm going to be evaluating for accessibility is a Google Doc that I typically use when I'm teaching language arts with one of the stories that we read. So according to the guidelines from Portland Community College, when you are making Google Docs accessible, the first thing you want to consider is having headings. And you can look at this by going to Format, and paragraph styles, and then these different paragraph styles are all your options for headings. And as I went through this document, all of mine were normal text, which means that there were no headings. It was just all the same. And so this is definitely something that I could improve upon. For example, I might have the directions as one heading, or I might give this activity a specific name, like I named it Visualize Details. That might be my overarching heading. And then a subheading could be the directions. And then under each example, I could add a heading that says example 1, example 2, example 3, and so on, to help increase the accessibility of navigating the document itself. The next thing you want to consider is images. Just like with your PowerPoints or Google Slides, your images should have alternate text. In this particular document, I don't have any images. I didn't feel that images were necessary because it's an activity on visualization. If anything, I would add an example. So maybe instead of just having this first page blank, I could have an image of the expectations so students know what they're reaching for. Typically, when I use this in school, we do the first one together, and so I demonstrate what's expected of the students. That being said, if it was an asynchronous environment and I was screencasting a video, I might want to already have an example made for them to easily look at and reference so that the expectations were clear and the assignment was clear. The next thing you want to consider is having lists. Again, just like with your PowerPoints and your slides, if you have a list of items where the order is important, you want to use a numbered list. Whereas if you have a list where order isn't important because it's a list of characteristics or qualities or things you should include or the parts of something, that's when you would use your bulleted list. Just that didn't really apply for this particular activity. Something that I could have considered doing differently are putting the directions in a list. Typically with my students, I bold the word directions and then write the directions out in sentences. As you see here, it says reread each section of the golden flower, determine what noun the author is describing, and highlight the descriptive language used by the author. Then draw the image you visualize in your mind. So if I found that directions in that format were unclear for my students, instead I could write those directions using a numbered list with what they do first, second, third, and so on. This document also does not have links either, but again, just like with PowerPoints, you want to make sure that if you embed links, that you have text that is hyperlinked and the text clearly lets the user know or the student know that if they click that text, it will take them to a link with a resource that they should access. Math and science is also not applicable here with equations. And if you were using math and science equations, you should be using Microsoft Word instead of Google Docs because Google Docs does not have an accessible way for a screen reader to read any math or science equations. Unfortunately, this document does not have tables either, but just like some of the other features I've mentioned, you might want to consider using Word if your document had tables as well, because on Word you can format column headings or row headings, whereas that setting is not available using the Google platform. Something that this document does well is color contrast. Everything is black and white, which will make sure that the text is very easy and clear for the readers to view. I also don't use any color to convey meaning. Instead, I have some different fonts. So for example, the directions are in one font. The word directions is in bold to draw the student's attention to that because sometimes they forget to read the directions. So I find that important. And then the text that is actually pulled from the book itself is in a different font so that they can differentiate between the directions and the text they're supposed to be reading and practicing the visualization strategy with. Something else I think this did well with in terms of being accessible by a screen reader is sometimes in my other documents I have accessed our online book and screenshotted a section of the text and added that to a worksheet. The downside to that is a screen reader would not be able to read that if a student were accessing it online because it is an image. Since this is typed text, the screen reader would be able to read it. If I did screenshot the book, then I would also have to go back and in the alternate text box, type what that text said in that photo to make sure that the screen reader would read the alternate text and so it could be understood by the student. And then finally, the last thing they addressed was the use of forms. And if you were using a form or incorporating a form or a survey, you would want to use Google Forms for that option, not Google Docs. So unfortunately, it was a little bit challenging to assess this particular document using the accessibility guidelines just because it was lacking a lot of those components. Some of those components I could add in to make it more accessible, like I mentioned how I could maybe use a list or how I could use an image to show the expectations of what students' work should look like to make sure they understood the assignment. But some of the other aspects I just don't think are necessary to make this more accessible. Like I don't think a link would be needed to make this more accessible unless I was providing a link that students could use to complete the assignment if they were doing it online. That being said, I still chose this to analyze because it did do some things well, like using different fonts and having color contrast. And I also liked that this was differentiated and accessible for diverse learners because of the format and nature of the task itself. And so really that's why I chose this one. And so that's what I'm going to touch on most here in the second half of my analysis. So in the Rice chapter, he talks a lot about how to make activities accessible for diverse students, no matter what their strengths are, what their needs are. And he relies a lot on the UDL principles that we explored in some of the other articles this week, like multiple means of representation, expression, and engagement. And it was primarily those reasons that I chose to analyze this document. So when I'm thinking about engagement, I find that this activity is more engaging for students because it has multiple ways for them to represent their understanding. A lot of times in ELA, students are assuming they're going to read text and then write something in response to it, and they love when they have a chance to engage with text in a different way, and they love when they have an opportunity to be creative. So I felt like this activity was more accessible because it boosted engagement by having students use highlighters and draw pictures. That also goes along with the concept of multiple forms of representation. Rice talks about how the more ways students can show what they know, the more accessible it is. So for example, in this particular activity, they're first deciding what is being described in the paragraph and then highlighting the descriptive language and drawing the image that they visualize. So that's showing what they know in multiple ways because they can highlight it in the text to show that they found the descriptive words. and they're drawing a picture. For some students, I might find that they were able to highlight the descriptive words, but their picture didn't really match the description. So I could tell that they understood part of it, but maybe weren't able to apply it to drawing their own picture. For other students, they might be able to really visualize what's happening, just not identify the language that's connected to that visual representation specifically. And so I could see that they're still able to visualize what they're reading, but maybe had I just had them highlight the words, they wouldn't have been as successful. So because they have the option to highlight or draw, there's multiple opportunities for them to show what they know and be successful. I could also provide students choice, and that's a way I could modify this to make it even more accessible and boost engagement, because a lot of times students are more engaged when they have choice. So I could give them the choice to highlight the words or draw the picture that represents what they're visualizing, or write a description of what they're visualizing. And if they had the option to highlight, write, or draw, that would boost their engagement as well. It's also a multisensory activity, which helps differentiate instruction in the sense that it's representing content in multiple ways. The text is presented as a visual for students to look at, but I would also be reading it aloud to students, and they could be using a screen reader to make it more accessible as well. It's also multisensory because of what I kind of touched on already. Like, they can use the highlighter to highlight, or they might use writing, or they might use drawing. And so that way it can support students, because not only are they engaged because there's options, but they will be able to more successfully understand the content because it's being shown in different ways when I model this activity. And they'll be able to show what they know in different ways that appeal to their strengths because there's choice there. So everything kind of goes hand in hand. Something that I think could be improved upon here is the way that this is chunked. There are 4 pages here, and each page has a paragraph, and that can be really overwhelming for students. So alternatively, I could just print them out as single pages, and rather than giving students the entire document, I could just give them one, and their goal could be one. And for students who really enjoy it or finish it quickly and are ready to do another one, then I could give them another one. But maybe for students where just one is all they can manage and accomplishing one is a huge success, then they can feel successful with accomplishing the one. It can also help them focus their attention because they won't feel overwhelmed by having 4 to do. They can just narrow it down on one. And then finally, the last thing is, I typically do this in a in-person environment, but I mentioned screen readers earlier in this video, and one way I could make it more accessible for students who are learning in person is by also assigning this document to them through their Google Classroom. And then they could use a screen reader to have their screen reader read the directions and read the paragraphs to them so they could be more successful independently. So to summarize, some things that this did well are differentiate and provide multiple ways for students to engage, to show what they know, and to have the content presented to them by using just audio and visuals and text and highlighters. There's a lot of options for students. Some things that this could improve upon are having visuals to show students expectations of what their work should look like, and chunking it so it's not so overwhelming for students and they can focus better. I would also, in the future, assign it to them digitally and allow them to use a screen reader so that all my students can be successful with listening or reading the text and completing the activity. Thank you so much for checking out my accessibility evaluations, and I'm looking forward to seeing yours as well.